Amen. And that's thanks to this next speaker that we got coming up. How many are you familiar with Minnesota Black Robe Regiment? Right on. Well, we got TC here today. To spit some knowledge at you. So, TC, I love you, brother. I can't thank you enough for this really Summer Patriots, the gatherings of we the people wouldn't be happening if this dude that wouldn't have had his event here. Changed the course of my life, really. So, I give you TC from the Minnesota Black Robe Regiment.
So, some of you are familiar with me. I've got a couple of fans somewhere, I know. Chad told me the other day that he was going to try and limit everybody to 15 minutes except for the members of the House and whatnot that came, and then he had somebody back out and he goes, "Can you fill time?" I'm like, "Can I fill time?" Those of you that have watched my short videos, you have no idea how hard that is for me. And YouTube's got this short take thing, or like this shorter videos, and it keeps telling me, when you upload a shorter video, I'm like, I'm uploading videos like 7 to 10 minutes now. How much shorter do you want it to be? But so I decided I was going to split what I wanted to talk about into two different speeches, segments, if you will. And I really, this one's going to be interesting for some of you, so here we go, right? I'm going to give you a 10,000-foot overview of, because we're in a church building, right? I'm going to give you this 10,000-foot overview of two Christian doctrines that are really well established, and you're like, okay, we're not here to get like preached at, TC. But these two Christian doctrines, they're biblical doctrines, have fundamentally powerful grips on the American Constitution, on the Republic of the United States. And it's what drove the men, sorry for anybody who's offended by me, maybe possibly misgendering our forefathers, but these men who started this great republic, this American experiment, right? And the first one is referred to as the doctrine of Lesser Magistrates, and tied into that is a doctrine that actually gets used in courts quite a bit. They don't always refer to it this way, but it's called the doctrine of imposition, right? So here's a 10,000-foot view of the doctrine of Lesser Magistrates. It basically says that just because you have this big high muckety-muck up wherever you're at, so if you're in the city, people will look at the mayor and know the mayor in the city. Or if it's at the state level, they'll say, oh, well, the governor is the highest elected position in the state. And what do we refer to the president as? He is the most powerful man of the free world, right? Sort of. But the doctrine of Lesser Magistrates doesn't say that. Now, certainly, the president is the highest executive authority at the federal level, and he has control of the federal administration in that regard. So that's why he can appoint the attorney general. He can appoint secretaries to his cabinet and whatnot. But does everybody have to do everything that the president says? No, right? Governor, highest executive authority in the state, right? Sometimes we get a governor we like, Kristi Noem. And if you don't like Kristi Noem, you can just keep that to yourself right now. But is the governor the all-powerful person in the state? No. And why is that? Because we have a separation of powers, right? We have it at the federal level, we have it at the state level. The separation of powers comes in and says, executive branch does executive things. Legislative branch, thank you for coming. Representative Mortensen, thank you. You're a brave man, honestly. Like, you could have come in here and just got ripped apart. So
Yeah,
What was that?
still might.
Oh, wait till I'm done with this. And then you also have the judicial branch, and every one of those branches, separate but equal.
No, not constitutionally.
No, but that's how we say separate but equal, and they're each supposed to have their own power, and they're supposed to execute that power, and that nobody else can infringe on that power, right? So, executive branch, governor, can't do what the legislature does. The legislature can't do what the governor does. And none of them are supposed to be able to do what the courts do. And that's all supposed to work together in a checks and balances sort of way, right? But sometimes we see that falls apart, right? Perfect example here in the state of Minnesota. The governor has taken to himself, and they say it's legal, certain amount of legislative power to dictate mandates through executive orders during a peacetime emergency. Okay? You're like, well, what's the problem with that? He's taken legislative powers, and the legislature, a long time ago, also gave itself the power of legislative veto over executive orders. Well, how's the legislature veto something? And as we see, that's not been working very. How's that been going? The legislative veto
doesn't seem to work very well.
Doesn't seem to work very well. It might be because maybe it's not supposed to work, right? It's not the way it's supposed to be. So now we have this big morass of things going on. And I promise you, I'm going to get to my point. Might take me a little bit, but I'll get there. What's a lesser magistrate? The lesser magistrate is any person from top down, or bottom up, right? From top down, who's in a position of public service, whether they be an elected servant or an appointed servant, who, when they see something not being done right, has not just a responsibility, but they have the authority to step in and say, no more. Remember, this is 10,000 foot view. And we see this in places like in the history of Israel, when I believe it was Caligula ordered the governor of Palestine in that region, ordered a statue of Caligula, of himself, to be made and to be placed where? Where did he want to put that statue? Wanted to put it in the temple. And the Jews lost their minds. And rightly so. They're like, no, you're not going to do that. So there's about 10,000 of these Jewish loyalists, patriots, showed up to the governor's mansion. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? They showed up to the governor's mansion and they said, we can't let you do that. We'll die if we have to, but we're not going to let you do that. And they fought and fought and fought with the governor of Palestine and said, please don't. And they knelt down and literally bore their necks and said, if we must die, we will die, but we are not going to let you just desecrate the temple. And they left. And they came back. And the governor sent out, I think it was 2 or 3 legions, so about 12,000 Roman soldiers. And Jews on the one side, the Hebrew people on one side, and all of these Roman soldiers on the other. And they had already committed to die if they had to. And the governor came out, and he listened to them. And he sent his legions away. And he wrote a letter to Caligula and said, I will not do this. You know how terrifying that is if you're a Roman governor, and you just told, and if you don't know anything about Caligula, it is not PG. The man was twisted, and I'm not going to get into detail, but the man was a very, very morally corrupt person. Even by today's standards. All right, so if you think we've got it bad, Caligula was even worse. And that governor resisted and said, I'm not going to do this, because my job is to keep the peace. That's the lesser magistrate. My job is to keep the peace and protect the people. And so that applies across the board. And that has been a Christian teaching for a very long time. That is a Judeo-Christian biblical perspective that the lesser magistrates step in when things are not going well. They're supposed to. And they tell the superior magistrate, enough's enough. That happened in Israel. Jeremiah. prophesies about the war with Babylon and tells them, don't fight this war. And they have him imprisoned. And the lesser magistrates failed. In fact, they were so upset they threw him in a dungeon, and he appealed that sentence, basically. And the king came and took an audience with Jeremiah, and pulled him up out. And the lesser magistrates failed again, came back and threw him back in the dungeon because they weren't doing their job. They weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And that's interposing, right? And this applies to every single person in public service. So, the esteemed representative, he has a responsibility, and I'm picking on you because you're here. He has a responsibility. It's not just a duty because it's his job. I hate that, right? And I'm just doing my job. Like, I don't want it to be just my job, whatever the case might be. You have a duty. You have a duty to interpose, to put yourself between the people and the one that's doing the harm. Right? So those two doctrines, this lesser magistrate and this doctrine of interposition, that person steps in. And sometimes it might come down to, it could be, your local beat cop. Everybody remembers the day when you used to have one cop in town, the little towns in Rocks and Cows, Minnesota, and they had one cop. And he was kind of on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and he drove around in a little white car with the one red light on top of it. And it might come down to that guy saying, you know what, you're not doing this. I know of in a particular jurisdiction, a particular person who was an elected law enforcement official was contacted by the Attorney General's office. And they're buddy up to him and like, hey, we're going to have you do this, and we're going to have you do that, and we really need you to kind of come alongside with all these executive orders. You're really important. We're trying to protect the people here, keep them safe from the coof. If you don't know why I say coof, just ask me later. It's a funny story. So we're trying to protect them. And this elected law enforcement official said, sorry, not interested. And boy, you know what happened with the Attorney General's office? They lost their mind. Why? Well, we're the Attorney General's office in the state of Minnesota. This is Keith Ellison's office. No, it's not. First of all, it's our office. Right? Okay? But that's one of those, do you know who you're messing with? I don't care. It was basically what it was. I don't care. I'm not taking part in what you want me to take part in. That's interposition. Now, some of you might have seen the video that I released last night. It's called, What's a Constitutional Sheriff? And if you haven't watched that, or if you've never seen me before, start with that one, because then you can just decide whether you like me right away. And since I've been here today, I've already lost 2 subscribers, and I haven't even spoke yet. Like, either YouTube's on to me, or people are just like, I'm just offended, look at him. But that's that interposition. That is this doctrine of the lesser magistrate. And I'm going to be doing a little bit of a series to kind of do a deeper dive on what that means and where it comes from. But historically, that is where the United States really got its start. People in the colonies, what do we hear all the time? No taxation without representation, right? That was because there was nobody standing for that. They had no one standing for them. There was no one interposing for the colonies. No one. They literally had nobody to do it, so they had to do it themselves. So they appointed their own Continental Congress. They said, this is what we're going to do. I mean, it wasn't just these guys all got together and said, we're going to, let's do this Declaration of Independence thing. It was just a bunch of weirdos from all over the colonies that just one day were having a beer at the tavern and said, oh, let's revolt. That's not how it happened. They got together and they talked about these things, and this all flows from Christian doctrine. So if people tell you the United States is not a Christian nation, there's some truth to that, okay? We're not an exclusively, you have to be a Christian to live here, right? They made that, they embedded that into the Constitution. Freedom to practice religion, right? What happened to the doctrine of interposition when our governor told us, oh, churches, we're going to put some limits on you. Churches, we're going to require you to wear masks. And there again, no offense to the esteemed representative who had the guts to come here today, but there were some people fighting against that, but it wasn't going anywhere. And people were like literally afraid that they were going to come in and shut their churches down. And everybody said, well, that can't happen in the United States, right? It did. They literally tried to lock churches out east. The government literally stepped in and said, we're going to take your building from you if you keep doing this. And you want to see a juxtaposition of how things happen in the United States versus how they happen in the rest of the world. And remember, we are the only country that has embedded in its constitution, in its founding documents, a guarantee of what? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and a freedom to practice, and a freedom to assemble, and a freedom to redress our government for a list of grievances, and a freedom to associate. We have all of that enshrined in our history through the Constitution, granted to us not by a piece of paper, not by a bunch of old white guys, but by God. Yeah. Right? By God. They acknowledge that, the God of nature. And he set that up, basically, not in a way that Christians would talk about Scripture being written, but inspired these men through the teachings of sound pastors and preachers to put all of this into the Constitution, because they knew what a lot of us have forgotten is that if we leave it up to human thinking, we're going to screw it up. And this is where, watch what's happening in Canada right now. They literally seized a church in Edmonton this last week. Seized a church. In the middle of the week, when no one was there, or at least they thought no one was going to be there. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a guy, I think he's called Angry at Burton. I think that's his channel, on YouTube or Facebook or whatever. And he's just going to town on the RCMP. Just goes nuts. I mean, civilly, but he just lets them have it. And the reason why it doesn't happen here as easily is because we have this Constitution and we have the doctrine of lesser magistrates. And what we need to do is we need to start pushing on our lesser magistrates. We talk a lot, right? Run for office. If you're that person and you don't mind being smeared, run for office. Okay? Because that's what they're going to do. They're going to smear you. They're going to call you all sorts of names. Especially if you happen to be a conservative or a traditionalist or a constitutionalist. They're going to smear you. They're going to come up with all sorts of things. They're going to try and paint you as a radical. They're going to try and paint you as a Christian nationalist or a white nationalist. They're going to do all that. But if that's you, run for office. Fine, great. Some of us aren't that person. Some people aren't comfortable getting up on the stage and speaking. That's fine. I would not have picked this for myself a year ago. But here I am. So, but what you can do is you can begin to push on those lesser magistrates. Start demanding that your mayors, that your sheriffs, start doing things. And I'm not saying tell them to go arrest the governor. If I hear that from one more, I want my sheriff to go arrest the governor. What? Well, there may come a time for that, but when you say I want my governor, my sheriff to take his people up and go arrest the governor, you're literally asking him to go with his deputies, leave his jurisdiction, go to St. Paul, and have a showdown with the state patrol. Now, how do you think that's going to happen? I mean, not one way or another, somebody's going to get hurt, or you're not going to accomplish what you think you're going to accomplish. But you start it locally, and you start putting pressure on those elected servants. You start putting pressure on those appointed servants to interpose for you because they are the lesser magistrate. And instead of trickle down, we're going to get trickle up. Because sooner or later, somebody's going to say, I'm done, right? There's a particular city here in southeast Minnesota, I'm not going to mention any names or of people, where there might be a business that's about to, see the proprietor of that business go to jail. Now, everybody's, it's only 90 days. Some of us would not do 9 minutes very well in jail. But imagine if all the people who are interested in what's happening with this particular individual in this particular town in southeast Minnesota, we started to get the people of that city and other people from around the state to not just go, yeah, we support her. Okay, great, yes, support. But start putting pressure on the lesser magistrates. What's the lesser magistrate in your town? Mayor, city council members, city administrators, and start saying, enough's enough. Do something about this. And yes, we can, talk about representatives listening to the guys with the money. That's great, but it shouldn't be, well, we're only going to come and listen to the people with the money. Because that's just crony politics. We just give all the power to the people with the money. Well, I don't have a lot of money, and he still should listen to me. Here again, I'm just using you as an example. But that's the case. It's not about how much money you have. It needs to be about the fact that you're an American and they work for you. You get fired up. Yeah, TBN. But this is, no, he's not. As Todd never moved it on TBN, it would burn down. But no, they work for you. And I don't care if you are retired and you're living on a small pension. I don't care. Or if you're the wealthiest person in town, it's not about how much money you have. It's about the fact that you're in charge. And the lesser magistrates work for you. And when you start putting pressure on them, I don't care if it's the House of Representatives, I don't care if it's your senator, I don't care if it's your dog catcher, I don't care if it's your sheriff, I don't care if it's one of the deputies. When somebody looks at you and says, hey man, I can't do anything about it, it's the law, I'm just doing my job, say, then you're failing at your job, and you need to interpose yourself, whoever you are, between we the people and a corrupt government. And sadly, it's not happening here in Minnesota for the most part. There are some, but there are so many people right now who are just going along to get along because they don't understand the doctrine of interposition and the fact that they're a lesser magistrate, and they have a responsibility and a duty to defend. And why? Because sadly, unfortunately, most of the time when people get into these positions, and I've said this before, especially when it comes to campaigning, it's a very long interview process, right? Sometimes it's 2, 3, 4 years of interviewing for a job. Hey, if you vote for me, I'm going to lower your taxes. I'm going to get you better education in your school district. I'm going to get you more aid for your farmers. And they make all these promises over and over and over. It's an interview. And then they get into office. Often, not all the time, but often they get into office and they're like, boy, I got to do something to keep this job. What am I going to do? I'm going to legislate myself into victory. And then they start playing politics. And instead of being worried, there again, not in every case, but instead of being concerned with what their constituents want, they become concerned with reaching across the aisle. Like, no, don't reach across the aisle. As a matter of fact, cut that entire section of the building off most of the time. I don't want to partner up with you because your agenda is counter-cultural, counterproductive to everything that the American people stand for. So no, I'm not going to reach across the aisle. In fact, I'm going to make a very vocal stand that I'm not going to play politics with these people. Oh, and Mr. Governor, we're going to shut your budget down. We're going to shut your budget down because we're lesser magistrates and we're going to interpose. And we need to take this to every single one of them. Emails, phone calls, letters to the editor. We need to start making everybody who serves elected or appointed understand we're in charge and we're not putting up with it anymore. And we will remove you from office one way or another. Remember, you interviewed for this job For how long? Months, years. And you made promises. And the day that you took office, one of those promises was that you were going to interpose yourself between us and a corrupt government that is taking away the constitutional liberties that are enshrined to us at both the federal level and at the state level. And we are not going to allow that to go on any longer. And if you will not interpose, then we will remove you from office. And I'm not talking about violence, but there are ways to make that happen. And that's why those two doctrines that I started off with are so important. And I would encourage you, Christian or not, study those doctrines. See what effect they have had on this nation and throughout the history of the world, especially the Western world. That's why we're here today, is because those doctrines gave us the rise of this republic. And we need to start reminding people who serve the people that they serve us. They don't rule over us. They serve us. And when we do that, when we take those doctrines and we apply them to our lives, and then we apply them to the lives and the responsibilities and the duties of other people that we put into those positions for particular reasons, it's going to start making a difference. And it might be, cut off campaign money. You don't get access to us anymore. No, we're not going to support you, and we're going to be very vocal about it. Sign a pledge. What's the pledge that's going on right now? The never again.
That's that dude. That's him. He's the one that authored that bill.
That's never again. Never again. And make sure. And then if they won't, embarrass them. If the left can dox us, we can embarrass people for not doing what their constitutional duties are. So, Chad, I don't know what we have next. I'm going to stop so I can say something like gas for later.